Today we are talking a lot about practice and practice-based learning and so on. But some years ago, it was a new thing, and from a point of view of research and theory. And how did you become interested in practice as an area of research?
Well, it's because at the time we wanted to rethink learning, not as the result of teaching, but learning as a phenomenon of its own. That was kind of the theme, you know. And so the best place to go and see how learning took place when it was not the result of teaching was to go and look at practice and how it was taking place there. So this is how, you know, we came up with this concept of a community of practice to talk about how practice created a kind of what we call a regime of competence where learning was taking place both for newcomers who wanted to join that community and acquire, become a member and therefore acquire the competence, and also for old-timers who were moving the regime of competence forward in response to new demands and so on and so forth.
But then today we talk a lot about this practice, but still we spend more and more time in educational settings. Do we have a dilemma there, saying we want to use practice as a learning place, but still youngsters and even adults spend a lot of time in educational institutions and participating in being taught?
Yeah, I agree with you. Now, you know, a school is also a practice. It's just a different practice, but it's also a practice. And, you know, if you are a teacher, especially in vocational education, if you are a teacher and you have an experience of practice, then you yourself can act as a window into that practice. So I think that, like many of the communities of practice that we look at today, when they are together as a community of practice, they don't practice in the sense that they learn together and then they go back to their team and do their practice. But in that moment, the fact that they each have a background of practice allows their conversation to be about practice, even though they are not necessarily practicing at that time, together at the time. And I think a teacher who is a practitioner, who has an identity as a practitioner, can invite students into that identity and give students a sense of what it's like to be that kind of person. So
the role of the teaching is opening up the window to another practice and at the same time being a practice.
That's right. I think that's a very important role. That identity of a practitioner is a very important role for a teacher. Yeah.
So there should be a difference between what is taking place in school and outside school in order to make a boundary.
What do you mean? When you mean by outside school, you mean like in the workplace? Or?
Yeah, I mean, if you have an apprentice who is being trained at a workplace, then he goes back to the technical college and has some theory and some workplace training there.
Right.
But the discussion is whether it should be very close to practice or it should be something different from practice in order to sort of develop a language about practice and in order to look at and understand one's own practice too. Participating.
Right. So I think that when we say learning in practice, I think we need to, that's what I was trying to get at with this notion of a landscape of practice and practice being located in a landscape of practice. So being a practitioner is always being engaged in certain activities, but these activities are in a broader context of a landscape of practice. And so I think that school, an important role of school would be to give the apprentices a sense of the landscape in which their own little hill belongs, because it is something that is not always easy to get from being involved in a so-called practice itself. And actually, one of my critique, I would say, of I don't have experience of the Danish system, but I've been an advisor on a Swiss project, and I've heard a little bit of about what the apprentices, the Swiss apprentices, do when they go to school. And they do two things. They do lab, where they practice the practice,
train.
but in a different context. And they do subjects like math, French, history, and stuff like this. And it's like, okay, maybe those are good things to do. But something that is completely missing here is a broader view of their practice. You know, it's like, how is their practice? If you're an auto mechanic, you'd want to know how is what you do related to the practice of engineering, the practice of auto safety, you know, the future, electric cars, is there things. It seems to me that the problem with, at least in the Swiss system, is that it's too focused on the curriculum and not focused enough on the identity of a practitioner, broadening that identity.
Because so this process of becoming and getting an identity like a mechanic and so on, you don't see the colleges as scaffolding that very much?
No, at least not from what I've seen in Switzerland, because it's very subject oriented.
Yes.
We're going to teach you math. We're not going to teach you what does math have to do with my practice. Where is math important in my practice? How has math influenced my practice? See what I mean? Yeah. It's like more like, how do you solve this equation? And in some cases it can be useful. I don't know. I'm not saying if you're an engineer, maybe having some math is useful. But mostly people who have chosen an apprenticeship is often because they don't like these subjects. It didn't teach, it didn't talk to them. So I don't know why the Swiss system is repeating that instead of saying what are the things that are meaningful to the identity of an auto mechanic or the identity of a nurse that are not, that you don't acquire by being in an auto shop or being in a ward. You see what I mean? So to say, okay, what is essential to this identity, to a successful identity, that you cannot acquire by being in work, this is what the school is going to do, you know?
I think we are trying to do it like that. We are trying to say that the subject should be trade related and should give them a broader understanding of their identity as an auto mechanic.
Very good. I'm glad.
Fitter, whatever.
I'm glad to hear that, because
we're not always successful, but at least the curriculum tells people to do that, and most of the teachers in Danish technical or vocational education in general, they have a background in the trade. They don't come from the university.
Right.
So, but if we go back to the basic, the community of practice, so the communities of practice are there, or we should establish them, or should we scaffold communities of practice, or do they evolve by themselves, or?
Well, I mean, many communities of practice already exist, right? And there are questions of how broad are they? You know, where is the main community of practice that those apprentices enter? You know?
But what demarks the community of practice? Where does it stop?
Well, communities of practice happen at multiple levels of scale, right? So if you are an auto mechanic, you're an auto mechanic in a specific workshop.
Yes.
Does this specific workshop have its own practice as opposed to auto mechanics in general?
Yes.
This is a good question, you know. And from a learning perspective, then the question is, does practicing mechanics in a specific workshop give you access to the broader community of practice that you belong to or that you want to belong to? To me, those are
the trade as such.
To the trade, yeah. But the trade is also a community of practice at some broader level.
Yeah.
It is institutionalized in many contexts. So there are questions about how ossified does a community of practice become when it is very institutionalized? Where are there still learning spaces that exist within that system? Those are the question of access to practice that would be interesting for the apprentices to be exposed to, you know.
So finding this authentic practice is, could say, it's a question of establishing an educational relationship. If we talk about vocational education, but how do you, as a researcher, identify is this authentic practice or is this just some kind of organization which people don't think they belong to? Do you get my question?
Well, I mean, So when
we all organized in a formal way in groups or departments or whatever.
That's right.
But that's not the same as a community of practice necessarily.
No, because many people don't find their community of practice in their department. They find their community of practice in a broader group of researchers. All I'm saying is that the question of what counts as authentic practice, when you see practice as part of a bigger landscape, is a difficult question, because it is not necessarily the doing of repairing a car.
No.
It's understanding why is this car like this? Where is the car industry going in the future? You see what I mean?
Yeah.
So the question of what is practice, when you take this broader picture, is an interesting question that I'm hoping institutions like yours will investigate, because I think pedagogically, at least in my experience, and maybe it's different in the Danish system, but what I'm hearing in the Swiss dual system is that for a large part, apprentices are kind of bored in their school time, because they feel like, oh, it's the same as the school I didn't like before.
No, it's the same as primary, lower, secondary, and I was very bored there, and I tried to avoid it, or I tried to escape it, becoming an apprentice, and then I'm back in school again.
Yeah.
Like that.
And what I'm saying is that I'm not saying that it is not important to learn other things, but what I'm saying is that we should focus on what is the identity that this person is becoming, and how do we enrich that so that they have a broader sense of who they are. So I don't know, for an auto mechanic what they should do. I have no idea, but it would be an interesting research. Should they spend some time in an engineering department somewhere
to understand the background?
To understand the background, or should they go visit a Tesla factory to see the car of the future? Or I don't know what a college like this should offer that goes beyond the experience.
In order to get a deeper understanding of the trade.
That's exactly. So what I'm saying is that to become practical, a college does not necessarily have to do the same thing. Sometimes I also see that what the college, the school does in those cases is kind of like reproduce more time to practice what they practice already. So I think that complementarity between school and the workplace should be really understood as a richness, not one reproducing the other, and not one just doing some schooling.
Often people use simulated environments in order to train some of this. This authenticity, could you create that in simulated environments?
Yeah, I think you can. Yeah, especially because a simulated environment can give you experiences that you could not have.
No, because they're too dangerous.
Because they're too dangerous, or they put a patient at risk.
Expensive, whatever.
Yeah. No, I think simulations are very good in broadening, giving the student the kind of experience that they need to be a well-rounded practitioner, but they cannot achieve in the concrete practice of a specific location.
So now we are trying to sort of define 3 domains of learning: the workplace and the college, but also something in between, a sort of middle ground with other rules.
Yeah,
we're
trying to think
close to practice, but you can fail and do things which are.
I think the question is, what can the college add to the identity of a practitioner, which the workplace does not contribute? And I think that's an interesting pedagogical question. Yeah.
So that's a good question for the colleges and the teachers at the college to sit down Friday afternoon. Let's ask ourselves this question.
Yeah. What if we think of the ideal practitioner, who not only is very good at doing certain things, but has a good sense of what their practice is in the broader landscape? How does the college help the students develop that kind of identity? I think to me, that would be the best pedagogical question to ask.
That's the first pedagogical question we have developed today, which is important to answer. Now we move into the next one. In the presentation today, you didn't touch so much on the notion of reification and the materiality of learning, but it's especially when you work with vocational education, it comes up. So how do you see reification as part of learning today?
Well, I mean, reification is inherent in learning, especially in practical, well, actually in both practical and theoretical learning, because theory is also a form of reification, you know. But of course, every practice has developed objects that define how people look at the world, whether those are tools or concepts. There are two forms of reification. So certainly engaging students with the reification that are central to the practice, and perhaps to the history of those reification, because reification always have a history, to the history of those reification and how they came about. I think that would be really an important part of the kind of.
But how would you describe the role of reification in the learning process?
Well, I mean, the role of the reification process in the learning process, first of all, starts with the role of reification in the work. Okay, so every practice has tools and concepts and measurement and all that that have been reified. Every practice has that. Even the most theoretical have that. So the question is, how do the apprentices understand those reification and the role that they play in the practice, and why they are the way they are, in terms, because practice is always a historical concept over time, and so the reification is always a moment in the trajectory of that practice. You know, you see what I mean? A tool is a moment. People have refined that tool because of mistakes and because of problems and so on over time. So a reification is always a moment in time in a process. That's why we talk about reification and not object, because an object is an object. But reification is a process of learning over time that translate experiences into things.
Yes.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
And what happens when these become more, what to say, esoteric? When the materiality is very obvious when we talk about craftsmen and so on, but a lot of things become virtual today and they become more fluent and so on. Does that make learning more difficult, or we don't know yet?
Yeah, I'm not sure it's all that different whether it's digital or physical. It's always the process of understanding how experience becomes translated into things, whether they are conceptual things
or things or whatever.
Yeah. And so I'm not sure that, well, the digitality probably allows manipulation and experimentation in ways that physical tools don't have.
But there's a lot of discussion about this right now, because like also in basic skills like writing and so on. And so if you write on a computer, do you become aware of things the same way as if you do it on paper? And
that's interesting. Okay. So that's interesting because so it changes. The changes in reification changes the practice. So that's really important. And for me, I can tell you, I couldn't write on paper. I don't know how these people did it 100 years ago. This idea that I would write, when I write, I put a few words here, a few words there. It's like putting a puzzle together. So certainly for me, the computer has completely changed my practice of writing in ways that makes it inconceivable to go back. So
it has enabled you to write in a way you would never be able to.
That's right.
On paper.
So the evolution of tools is a center. But again, it's a moment in history.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's interesting. It's the same. I mean, books. A lot of books come out as e-books and so on today, and real hardcore readers and writers is sort of against it because it's not a real book. But still,
Well, but you can do things.
If you come here to Europe from California on a plane, you can have 100 books with you. And
That's
you
right.
can
And if you say, oh, that was an interesting thought I read in that book, you can search.
Yeah,
Right?
that's right.
So being able to search, or you can mark, you can put annotations, right? And so and you can then search your annotations. So the new tool allows you to do things that were very difficult. If you just remember a word that was mentioned in the book, it would take forever to search for it in a physical book. So I think
it's smarter, but it's
it allows you to do. But there is also something about the physicality of a
nicer
book that has a quality to it. So so sometimes myself, if I'm writing, sometimes I feel a need to print, and I know it's not very ecological, but I feel a need to move away from the screen, print, go sit somewhere, read my chapter, write on it.
Yeah, I understand.
Because there is something different.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Which moves us back again to the communities of practice, because what happens when they become virtual? For some years ago, you worked a lot with virtual communities of practice. How do you see that today? That's just another way of doing things?
Yeah. So, the fact that now our interactions can transcend space and even time sometimes, because people in different time zones can still communicate, really opens the geography of learning partnerships. But I'm not sure it's a different beast. It's just different forms that it takes. But I don't talk so much about virtual communities of practice, but communities of practice that use virtual tools.
Yeah.
But it doesn't make the community less of a learning partnership or more of a learning partnership. You know, no, there are certain things that you can do. You know, for instance, if a member needs help, you know, you can even take a camera into the location where that help is needed. And so, again, tools open new possibilities. I'm not sure that they change the foundation of what the practice is about.
We do the same practice, we just do it in different sort of...
But this has been true since the beginning of humankind, you know, that different tools appear and change the way we do that practice. When I was doing my PhD, I was studying in office in an insurance company. It was years. They were still talking about the time when computers came. Yeah. Before they would do everything on paper. You know, if they received something from a client, they had to go look for the folder, pull the file, bring it to the, and bring it back, and suddenly the computer, boom. Yeah. So it transformed their practice very, very, very deeply.
But it also, in a way, I guess, changed what it means to be good at something. Also, you talk about the regime of competence, where we sort of define what are the qualities of this.
Yeah.
And if we go back to your PhD, it must have meant that these people working there at the insurance company, they had developed different competences and new qualities.
Absolutely.
And some of them who had been very good were not so good any longer. And
absolutely.
So there's a power aspect of it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And so the fact that the world can be transformative.
Yes.
And require, and I'm sure that earlier we were talking about auto mechanics. Right. I'm sure that with electric cars, you know, or with autonomous vehicle and all that, the practice of auto mechanics is going to be transformed substantially, you know. So that there's no. That's why you have to see a practice always as a history of learning, and there are continuous processes of learning, and they are transformative process of learning where a practice, because of the
Changes.
appearance of a new tool, is substantially changed, and what it means to be competent is very different.
We can change, of course, as you said, we can change because we move into other practices of communities of practice and backwards again, but it could also change over time, so we have different dimensions of it.
Yeah. It always changes over time. That's where the community, your college can add very much to the identity of a practitioner, because what they experience in the workplace is only one point in time. They don't see the trajectory because they are just
very situated.
Very situated in one point in time. But a practice is not situated in one point in time. A practice is a history.
Yes.
And so, if your college, one thing that your college could help the apprentices is to see that moment in time where they are involved in a specific job, in the broader trajectory of an evolving practice, and to get that sense of history. I think that would be a good contribution.
And that would sort of combine their personal identity development with the history of the trade.
That's right, exactly, yeah.
So, but we have talked about these communities of practice, but today you also took the social learning space into and said it's not the same, but it's related to it, or how should we understand this?
Well, so
it's very difficult for us when you sort of change your theory, because
changes always changes. See, a theory is never fixed. A theory has to account for the world. And when something doesn't fit, you need to change the theory.
And some tries the other way around to change the world, but
but it's very simple. See, the term community of practice has been used by people to refer to two different phenomena. One is that history over time of developing a regime of competence.
Yes.
Okay. And the other is a certain form of interaction with each other around learning, a certain form of learning partnership. So people have used the community of practice to talk about apprenticeship, entering, becoming a member, and all that. But also to say, hey, why don't we have a community of practice this afternoon from 4 to 5?
Yeah.
And I can see what they mean.
But it's like
we appear and we will learn together.
Is this a community of practice?
Not really. Not really. So we needed another. They called it a community of practice because they didn't have a better term, and so we created the term social learning space to talk about that form of mutual engagement. Now,
which is more temporary,
or it can be also over time, but not involved that we have the same practice.
No.
You see what I mean?
Yeah.
So we've created this concept not to replace communities of practice, but to add to
enhance it somehow.
To add to the way that we can talk about social learning in different contexts. Okay, and many communities of practice are also social learning spaces, or a series of social learning spaces. And some social learning space over time become communities of practice. But I think it gives you more analytical sharpness to be able to have those two concepts, and how they overlap or not, become one another or not. These are more interesting questions that you can ask with this new development of the theory.
Great. You also said that the identity, the development of identity, was originally you thought much as related to the physical space, and now you would say it's more situated in the trajectory of learning as such.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah. So the term situated has often been interpreted as a physical thing, right? That learning is situated in the physical doing of the practice. And we want to say, okay, learning is situated in the history of a practice.
Like that.
Okay? And the history of the practice is broader than simply a physical act somewhere. Okay? And also in the identity of participants, that engagement, what makes it meaningful, is related to a broader trajectory. So all I was trying to say is that what we mean by situated, when we still use the term, is not just the physical place,
No.
but it's the broader social landscape in which practices are defined and in which trajectories of identity are also defined.
I think we would also say that you could also see it as the difference between if you are in a workplace, you have skilled and unskilled workers, and and the unskilled workers, he would or she would often be as good at doing the things as the skilled worker, the actual thing, doing screwing, whatever, and then but the skilled worker would know the background, the history, the trajectory, and so on. So if something new is happening or something unexpected, he or she would know how to cope with this.
Yeah,
or
yeah,
that.
exactly.
Whereas the other could just stand back and say, well, it worked before, now it's not working.
That's right. That's
Help
right.
me.
That's right, because the same activity is situated in different trajectories.
Yes.
I think that's you got exactly what I was trying to say. That it is important to see activities as situated in trajectories of communities, of systems of competence, and of people's trajectory through these systems. Yeah.
Great. You said, and maybe that's the second question we should put in here if we have to find two good questions, that meaning should drive the learning or meaning comes later. You say that when we are working practice, it's meaning that drives the learning, whereas in educational settings we are very often saying, well, you have to learn this, you don't understand why you should learn this, but you'll find out later. And sometimes that is probably necessary and so on, but could education learn something from the meaning-driven process in practice?
That's my hope. You know, if my theory is going to do any good, that's one of the things that I'm hoping it will do. You know, is that school context will take more responsibility for meaning, and not just responsibility for information and skills. That is to me to be important. I would agree with you that there may be certain things that we want our students to learn, whether it's meaningful or not, right? I don't think,
as a society,
I don't think that a student should be able to graduate from high school without knowing how to read, right? But I think that we should try to say, what is the minimum that anybody should learn, meaningful or not? Not the maximum, not like, how can we fill the time?
So the second question we should ask ourselves at the teachers' meeting at the college would be, how do we make learning here more meaning, or how do we make teaching a more meaningful process, so we could enhance learning or something like that?
And I think my suspicion, but you will have to decide for yourself, but my suspicion is that you would gain insight into that question by focusing on issues of identity for the apprentices and not so much focusing on issues of curriculum and what the curriculum should contain. You see what I mean?
Yes.
That's just, it's very related, but it's a kind of a shift in perspective, you know? Yeah.
That's a very important reflection we will start here.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming here.
Okay, no, my pleasure, really.